2Corinthians chapter 10. We're continuing our textual study, and we are nearing the end. We've just got a few more chapters left. Just a quick review while you're looking that up. Paul spent a lot of 2 Corinthians talking about defending his own position as an apostle to the church at Corinth. Then he changes his conversations and starts talking about this gift that he was administrating for the Judean Christians. Now he's going back to this defensive ministry because it's one of the main thrusts of this letter. And let's hope that that doesn't happen much. All right, 2 Corinthians chapter 10. Let's read a few verses first and then we'll talk about it. By the humility and gentleness of Christ, I appeal to you. I, Paul, who am timid when face to face with you, but bold towards you when away. I beg you that when I come, I may not have to be as bold as I expect to be towards some people who think that we live by the standards of this world. For though we live in the world, we do not wage war as the world does. The weapons we fight are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. And we will be ready to punish every act of disobedience once your obedience is complete. So Paul is going back to this concept of being an authority in this church and needing to correct something when he arrives, which is what most of this letter is about. Now, we don't know a lot of the specifics, but many people have suggested that he was countering false apostles who were really Gnostics coming in trying to teach a different Jesus than the one that Paul was preaching. Either he didn't come in the flesh, or he wasn't really God, or a whole bunch of different... Gnostics is a really broad group of theological people, but we think that's probably what he was arguing about. But he's going to show up and challenge these, what he calls super apostles, which are really false apostles. And maybe super apostles is the name they gave themselves. We don't know. But we know that he's going to go in and challenge them. And listen to what he says. By the humility and gentleness of Christ, I appeal to you. I, Paul, who am timid. Now you might notice your translation has timid in quotation marks. Those are not there in the original Greek because they didn't have quotation marks. That was added by later translators. Timid when face to face with you, but bold towards you when away. The reason he says that is because later on you will find out he was being accused of being bold in his letters, but when he shows up, it's like, well, he's no big deal. In fact, many people have taken this and several other scriptures to suggest that Paul might have been a very poor public speaker. In fact, there was one depiction of Paul that I just found absolutely hilarious. He was a nerd. Just a complete geek. He had the glasses with the tape, and no social skills whatsoever, and very soft-spoken, and people have suggested that because if you think about, for one, there's several examples in Scripture that suggested that Paul was not very big, okay? So he's not impressive in physical appearance. And it's in several other places, it's possible that Paul was not an eloquent speaker. Now, why would that be a big deal? It's whether or not he's a servant of God, not whether or not he's a good public speaker. Well, I'll show you why. In ancient Greece and ancient Rome, that entire time period, one of the most important things you learned in school was what's called rhetoric. Today we have the term rhetoric. We use it slightly differently than they did back then. But back then, rhetoric was basically public speaking, okay? And public arguing. It would be like debate class today, okay? And you took that because of the emphasis the culture placed on logic and reason. And the problem with logic and reason is just because you can understand it perfectly doesn't mean someone else knows you're understanding it if you can't communicate it. And so they made the assumption that intelligence and reason went right along with communication. We know today that some of the most intelligent people are very poor communicators because they're not good at that. And we know there's different levels of intelligence. And they didn't know that. They felt that if you were a very intelligent person, you could communicate well. Well, guess what else we've learned? That you can be a really good communicator and be an idiot. And so there were people running things that had no business running things because they were good speakers. In fact, we find that in our culture today, where we have people, especially in our mass media society, if you will, we have a lot of idiots running things. People that don't know what they're talking about, but are very good at talking about it, and everyone listens to them. It's really scary how much we're like ancient Rome. It's really, really scary. But that was a very important thing to their culture. And so if Paul wasn't bold when he was with them in face to face, or if he wasn't a very good public speaker, he's probably being accused of not being very intelligent, or even certainly not right. And so these super apostles are making that accusation. But I want to show you Paul's tactic, because it's very different than the people of his day or even the people of our day. Look at verse 1. By the humility and gentleness of Christ, I appeal to you. Paul doesn't start with forceful, bold arguments and logic. What does he start with? The humility and gentleness of Christ. Well, now that's just counterintuitive. If you want to convince, when I was coaching debate, I would tell them, sound like you know what you're talking about, even if you don't. If you want to win the round, you've got to sound confident. Paul doesn't start with confidence. He starts with humility and gentleness. He doesn't start forceful like the world does. In fact, we'll see him verifying that here in a little bit. He says, in fact, he's appealing to them. He's asking them, not demanding. I, Paul, who am timid when face to face with you, but bold towards you in a way. Verse 2, now he's begging, I beg you that when I come, I may not have to be as bold as I expect to be towards some people who think that we live by the standards of this world. So Paul says, look, I'm going to be bold. If I show up and these super apostles are standing there, guess what? They're going to see the bold side of Paul. But what does he say instead? I beg you, please don't make me do that. You see, that's part of the difference. And by the way, I want to point out here, if you notice that Paul starts with humility and gentleness, but he's still going to be bold. Humility and gentleness are not the opposite of boldness. Boldness is just confidence and solid sureness, where you're stable, you're not moved around by arguments, and you're confident in yourself. Okay? Paul's like, I'm going to be bold. Don't worry about it. Please don't make me be as bold as I expect to have to be towards who? Look at what he says. Towards some people, and you know who you are, towards some people who think that we live by the standards of this world. Again, Paul goes back to this idea, look, stop measuring me by worldly standards. In fact, we learned several chapters ago, Paul was telling them that we don't judge people by the material anymore. We used to judge Christ that way, but we don't anymore. Okay, he's saying stop using the world standard to judge things. Now, we hear that. We think, well, yeah, but we do it all the time. We're constantly evaluating things by the world's standards because that's what we know. You know, it's easy to say that, 3,000 talents is 2 tons of gold, right? We can say that. And that's easy to measure and it's easy to weigh, but we're using the world's measurements and standards. Jesus said that widow who put 2 copper pennies in the bucket gave more than David when he gave when he gave that pile of gold. So we don't measure by the world's standards, instead we measure by God's standards. And it's possible that Paul's also arguing, look, just because they're good talkers. Anyone ever see, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? With the main character who he had the gift of gab, but he was an absolute moron. I always think of that every time. It's like, look, just because you're good at talking doesn't make you smart. Never mind. That was, everyone keeps telling me to stop making fun of myself. I really do have self-esteem. It's just easier to make fun of me than it is somebody else. Okay. Verse 3. For though we live in the world, we do not wage war as the world does. The weapons we fight with, verse 4, are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. So Paul says, look, don't measure by the world's standards. In fact, don't even fight with the world's weapons. Now, this could mean several things, and I'm going to apply it in a way that I don't think Paul is particularly intending in this place. But what does the world do in America when they don't get their way politically? What do? Yeah. They fight, they scream, they shout, they picket, they boycott. What do Christians do in America today when they don't get what they want politically? Yeah, they do the same thing, don't they? We have bought in, of course I say we collectively, not necessarily you, but we have bought into this idea that we have to fight the way the world does in order to win. Well, you don't fight that way. We have much better weapons than that. Look at what it says in verse 3. For though we live in the world, we don't wage war as the world does. Verse 4. The weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have divine power to do what? Demolish strongholds. Now, we have bunker-busting bombs and stuff that there's not much strongholds left we can't send something after. But back then, if you lived in a stronghold, it could take years to break through. In fact, many centuries after this was written, when Jerusalem was under siege, when the Turks had it and the Europeans were trying to take it over, or maybe it was the other way around. Anyway, it was under siege for years before they finally took the city over. A fortification is a pretty powerful thing. And he says, look, you can demolish strongholds with the divine power of these weapons. And so we look at that, we say, oh, that's awesome. I want some of those weapons because I got some strongholds I need demolishing. Well, guess what? That stronghold never wears a face. It's never going to be the person you think it is. Well, that person is definitely a stronghold I need to tear down with the weapons of God. No, because God's weapons never tear down a person, because that person's created in the image of Christ. What are we talking about here? Look at verse 5. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. The weapons of God have divine power to tear down arguments, thoughts, pretensions. We had that word in Sunday school class. It's some of you have anything that exalts itself. It means to pretend that you are higher than what that is. No, it was presumptuous we had in Sunday school. But anyway, the idea of setting yourself above what God has established. And why does Paul say those things specifically? Because that's exactly what he was fighting. He was fighting these false apostles who had come into the church and were teaching things that they were exalting themselves above the truth of God. In fact, that's one of the reasons why they've suggested that this was a Gnostic group that had infiltrated the church, because one of the things the Gnostics loved was knowing. That's what the word Gnostic means, to know. And they have all these secret knowledge. Love secret knowledge. Oh, did you get the secret knowledge from God? God doesn't have any more secret knowledge. The big secret was that Jesus was going to die for everybody, and it's been revealed 2,000 years ago. That was it. Everything else, he's like, hey, it's just right out there. All you got to do is take it by faith. Okay? And no more secrets. And yet these people had secret knowledge because it made them feel special. I'm better than you because I have secret knowledge that you don't have. And so that's one of the reasons why they've suggested that. Because he's saying here that these people have exalted their arguments, they have exalted their thoughts above what Christ taught. Okay? There was a great preacher one time, and he was a traveling preacher, and he was talking to some people in the church after they had stopped, and this guy came up and he said, oh yeah, I'm a prophet and walk in the gift of an office of a prophet. He's like, oh, well, that's fantastic. He said, yeah, God reveals all kinds of great things to me. He's like, oh, okay. He said, so like what kind of stuff? And he starts saying a couple things, and he says, well, I don't see that in the Word. And he said, oh, he's taking me far beyond the Word. And the preacher goes, well, then that's too far. If you've gone beyond the Bible, that's too far. Because the Bible is the measuring rod, the establishment. That is the line of Christ. And if you exalt yourself above it, then you have become pretentious, if you will. Okay? So these divine powers demolish strongholds of the mind. Now, we can use that truth in our own lives personally, where we demolish the lies of the devil that he's convinced us is true. But what Paul's specifically talking about is demolishing those arguments with other people, where other people bring those arguments in and you're able to demolish them, not necessarily in their own hearts, but with other people. And that, in Paul's case, usually happened with a miracle, where they were like, oh, this is the truth. And Paul said, no, that's not the truth. See that guy? He used to be dead. Okay? God raised him from the dead. So I'm right. That's kind of the argument Paul would use. Not that he wasn't a good arguer or debater, but he did not rely on that. In fact, he said in one place that I was, Basically, I had decided to know nothing but Christ and Him crucified. So, anyway. Okay. Go to verse 7. Well, hold on. Verse 6. I missed one. And we will be ready to punish every act of disobedience once your obedience is complete. Paul was going to punish the disobedience, and that's probably the heresy that the false apostles were teaching, and more than likely it would be by removing them from fellowship. Okay, verse 7. You are judging by appearances. If anyone is confident that they belong to Christ, they should consider again that we belong to Christ just as much as they do. So even if I boast somewhat freely about the authority the Lord gave us for building you up rather than tearing you down, I will not be ashamed of it. I do not want to seem to be trying to frighten you with my letters, for some say his letters are weighty and forceful, but in person he is unimpressive and his speaking amounts to nothing. Such people should realize that what we are in our letters, we are when we are absent, we will be in our actions when we are present. So Paul says in verse 7, verse 8, he says he's going to boast rather freely about the work that God has given him. And he starts in verse 7 by showing them the reason for that. He says, you're judging by appearances. Now there's two different ways to translate that. I'm not sure I wrote them down. Darn it, I didn't. I've got the Greek right here. Or the King James says, do you look on things after the outward appearance, is how the King James translated it. Another translation, who has something different? Because I can't remember what it said. Be verse 7. On the surface of things. Now there was a different way to translate it. I can't remember. Maybe it was the Amplified. What's that? Say the whole thing again. That's right. That's what it was. It can be translated where Paul is telling them to look at the obvious, to look at, his apostleship. Another way to translate it is, don't look at the material that you can see. And the reason I think a lot of translations use that is because it coincides with the way he's speaking earlier about not judging by the world's standards. So both ways are legitimate translations of the Greek. I'm going to look at it the New International way and say you're judging by appearances, and because it goes back with the other stuff. So again, Paul brings up that idea that we don't judge by what we can see. Okay, we don't judge by what appears in front of our eyes just because a person is a good public speaker or a good arguer. I remember talking to someone the other day and they said, well, this person was talking to me about this and they convinced me. I said, it's not hard to convince someone. I was a debate coach. It's actually pretty easy to convince someone if there's no one there arguing against you. But people can be convinced. And he says, look, don't judge by what they say. Don't judge by the way they look or the way they speak. Judge by what Christ has said about it. Okay, so verse 8. So even if I boast somewhat freely about the authority the Lord gave us for building you up rather than tearing you down, I will not be ashamed of it. I do not want to seem to be trying to frighten you in my letters let's stop with verse 8. I'm not going off my notes enough. Getting myself confused. Okay. So Paul boasts about his authority that the Lord gave him. Okay. Now, in Romans, I think it's Romans, Paul is talking and he says, the people that are authorities over you lord it over you. They hold it over you and they use it as a benefit for them and they oppress you with that. He says, don't be like that. And even Christ said the same thing. Don't be like that, but rather be a servant. And Paul's saying here, the authority that God gave him was for building up the church, not tearing down the church. And that's an important distinction because some people will get into a position of authority and it'll go to their head and they'll start to abuse the people they have authority over. Paul says, my authority is for your benefit. It's not to limit you. It's not to take your self-pride away or anything like that. It's there to help you. Okay? And more than likely, the false apostles were tearing people down with their authority, and that's why he brought it up. Then in verse 9, he says, I do not want to seem to be trying to frighten you with my letters. For some say his letters are weighty and forceful, but in person he is unimpressive, and his speaking amounts to nothing. Such people should realize that what we are in our letters when we are absent, we will be in our actions when we are present. So Paul says, look, I don't want to scare you guys with these weighty letters, but I want to make sure you get the point. I want to make sure you understand that these guys are not legit. and that I am. And then he's going to explain how that works here in just a minute. Go to verse 12. We do not dare classify or compare ourselves with some who commend themselves. When they measure themselves by themselves and compare themselves with themselves, they are not wise. We, however, will not boast beyond proper limits, but will confine our boasting to the sphere of service God Himself has assigned us to, a sphere that also includes you. We are not going too far, in our boasting, as would be the case if we had not come to you, for we did get as far as you with the gospel of Christ. Neither do we go beyond our limits by boasting of work done by others. Our hope is that as your faith continues to grow, our sphere of activity among you will greatly expand, so that we can preach the gospel in the regions beyond you. For we do not want to boast about work already done in someone else's territory, but let the one who boasts boast in the Lord. For it is not the one who commends himself who is approved, but the one whom the Lord commends. So Paul is again comparing himself with the false apostles, and he says in verse 12, we don't classify or compare ourselves with some who commend themselves. And then he says, when they measure themselves by themselves or compare themselves with themselves, they are not wise. What does that look like? Well, it looks like self-proclaimed experts. Got a lot of those in our culture today. And if you're not on the internet, you probably don't see them very often, but they're all over YouTube. And they know exactly what they're talking about. And you know what they'll compare themselves to? Themselves. Look at how good I am because I know this. Yeah, but compared to an expert, you know nothing. But they never give you that comparison. All they show him is how good we are. And you see a lot of the same things when it comes politics time and all the political ads. Look how good I am. Of course, they will compare with other people if they're mudslingers. But this idea of commending themselves. I remember when I first came into town, like 2 weeks after I moved to town. Actually, it might have been before I got here, but anyway. An individual approached me and, said, I hear you're a new pastor in Hoxie. Yeah, I am. And he said, you need an apostle. Really? That's good to know. Thank you for sharing that. Well, I happen to be an apostle, and I would like to be your apostle. And it was like, are you a salesman? What's going on? It was really weird. And I told him, I said, well, thank you. I have an apostle. He would never claim that title, but his name is Steve Dinkle. And of course, this guy knew Steve, and so he's like, oh, well, okay. But, and he may have been a good guy. I don't know. I really don't know the guy. That was the only interaction I'd ever had with him. But it looked like I'm an apostle. Okay. You're an apostle. That's great. You're not my apostle because you had nothing to do with my spiritual life. In fact, Paul says, look in verse 13, we will not boast beyond proper limits, but will confine our boasting to the sphere of service God Himself has assigned to us. You see, Steve has had years of input in my life. God has demonstrated His apostleship to me as a pastor, as an authority over me. And I go to Him with issues and questions, and I'm accountable to Him. Not the church, by the way. This is my personal thing, okay? And that's because I need that kind of person in my life. I need a Paul. I need an apostle, okay? But this other guy, I didn't know him. He may have been a crackpot for all I know. And so, Paul's saying, look, I'm an apostle. I planted the church, okay? You know me. You know my word. You know the deeds that God did through me. And so you can trust that I'm your apostle. And there's a lot of people on TV today that'll be, do you need an apostle? Yes, I do. But you know what? I'd like to actually know the guy. Not just see him on TV. Because you don't know what goes on after that camera's turned off. You have no idea. Okay? You guys understand what I'm saying? All right, good. Got to keep moving here. Running out of time. So Paul limits his boasting to the sphere of influence that God has given him, or more specifically, he says the sphere of service, because that's what an apostle is. It's one who goes and serves with the gospel. And then verse 15, he says, neither do we go beyond our limits by boasting of work done by others. More than likely, that's what these false apostles were doing. They were claiming, oh, look how great the church is going. It must be me. And it's like, no, it's not you. Our hope is that your faith continues to grow, or as your faith continues to grow, this is verse 15, our sphere of activity among you will greatly expand, verse 16, so that we can preach the gospel in regions beyond you, for we do not want to boast about work already done in someone else's territory. In fact, Paul didn't even want to go into anyone else's territory. He told I think it's the church at Rome, he's like, there's no place for me to go here in Asia Minor anymore. Every place has already got a church. I want to go to Spain. So can I come to you and then you send me to Spain? Was his question at the end of the book of Romans. Because he's like, all churches are all here. Every town's got a church. I need to go someplace where people haven't already ministered. And it's kind of like, I remember when I first became a pastor, I was reading a book and I heard the term sheep stealer. And I was like, what? Sheep stealer? But that's apparently a phrase among pastors where there are pastors that will try to take sheep from one congregation and bring them into another. Okay? Now, if you've left a congregation and come into this one, don't feel bad about that, okay? But I'm never going to come to you and say, you need to come to my church. I'm never going to do that. Even if you did. I'm not going to say that because I'm not going to boast about work done by somebody else. Because that's not okay. That's not how a spiritual leader behaves. You know why? Because we don't have to. Because that's not our job. Our job is to be obedient to Christ. And wherever He sends me, you remember the story of Paul where he's trying to get into Asia Minor in the book of Acts? And it says the Spirit of Christ wouldn't let us. And then he had a dream that night of someone in Macedonia say, come over here. God had handpicked places to send Paul so that his message would be received. He sent Apollos to other places. Okay, we know at least of those two. And Silas ended up going to other places as well. He sent Philip maybe? Anyway, I think it was Philip, to Samaria and started a revival. So God picks where He wants the spiritual leaders to go, and we need to stay in those places. Okay, verse 18, let's finish this out. For it is not the one who commends himself who is approved, but it is the one the Lord commends. Now, how does God commend a person? We know what it looks like when a person commends themselves, because the world does that all the time. How do we know if God is commending a person? I'm going to give you two examples. The first one is the fruits of the Spirit. Does the fruits of the Spirit manifest in that person's life? Okay? The second one is the gifts of the Spirit. Do the gifts of the Spirit manifest themselves in that person's life? Now you got to be careful because there are a lot of people that are called into ministry that don't even believe in the gifts of the Spirit. They still walk in several of them, they just don't know it. You know, they'll read in the Bible and go, what a great idea I've had, but that's really prophecy, they just don't know it, okay? So are the fruits of, and of course the fruits of the Spirit come first, and that's why you need to know the person, okay? Do the fruits of the Spirit manifest in their life? Are they kind? Are they gentle? Do they have joy and peace, self-control and all those things? And then of course the gifts of the Spirit was specifically how Paul did that as well. Now does that mean that that person is your spiritual authority? No, that's a whole different story for a whole other time. We're not going to get into that today. But if you're looking at a person as a possible spiritual authority and you want them to be maybe a mentor in your life, look first for the fruits of the Spirit and then look for the gifts of the Spirit. And if neither of those things are there, probably ought to keep looking. All right. Next week we'll get into the specific accusation of their false apostleship in 2 Corinthians chapter 11 and talk more about false teachers. But today I want you to walk away with this. God has people He's placed in your life. I call them spiritual fathers because mine happen to all be guys. Maybe in your case it's spiritual mothers that were there or are there for your benefit. And some of the spiritual fathers that I've had in my life have done tremendous things. Steve is one of them. You guys might remember I went to the funeral of the other. Ken Massey passed away a year and a half ago. And, or a year ago. And a tremendous man. And what he did in my life was amazing. And there are several others that I won't get into, but we need to look at those people and accept from them the truth, because if we don't have anyone that can speak truth into our lives, we can be deceived like the church in Corinth was and be led astray from the truth. So I want to encourage you guys to consider that. All right, let's close with a word of prayer. Father, we thank you that you have placed Pauls in our life, people that can speak the truth and correct us and be bold. And Father, I pray that you would give us wisdom as we look to those people, that you would give us discernment in our spirit and allow us to hear from you ourselves. And Father, I pray that we as a congregation would understand your word and how it applies to us each and every day. Lord, in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.